They told him the creature in containment could hear a heartbeat from across the room. But no one warned Ethan Cole what it would feel like to stand 3 feet away from her in silence as the station lights flickered overhead and the air tasted faintly of ozone and recycled metal. The corridor outside Containment Bay 7 was colder than the rest of the station by at least 10 degrees, his breath barely visible as he keyed in his clearance, and the heavy door slid open with a low hydraulic sigh, revealing the faint glow inside like something alive waiting in the dark. He wasn't supposed to look at her for long, just diagnose the failing energy grid and get out. That's what the supervisor said. No lingering, no interaction, no curiosity. But curiosity had always been the one thing Ethan was bad at ignoring. The same flaw that had gotten him stranded on this rusted orbiting relic in the first place. Inside, the containment field hummed with a soft, almost melodic vibration, a lattice of light wrapping around the figure at its center. And for a moment he forgot the diagnostics panel entirely, because she didn't look like anything the reports described. She was standing still, too still, as if time moved differently around her, skin catching the dim light with a faint blue sheen, hair falling like liquid shadow over her shoulders, and eyes closed as if she were listening to something far away. Not dangerous, his mind tried to insist, not like the stories, but then again the stories always got things wrong until they didn't. He stepped closer, boots echoing softly against the metal floor, tools clinking at his side, and the temperature dropped another few degrees the nearer he got, like stepping into the shade of something massive you couldn't see. Okay, he muttered under his breath, pulling up the panel and pretending his pulse wasn't climbing. Just a system check, nothing else. But his eyes drifted back to her anyway, tracing the subtle rise and fall of her breathing, the way the containment field bent slightly around her like it was the one being held in place, not her. And then, before he could stop himself, the thought slipped out in a whisper, barely louder than the hum of the station. She's stunning. The word hadn't even fully left his lips when her eyes opened. It wasn't sudden, not a jerk or a startle, just a slow, deliberate awareness unfolding, revealing irises that caught the low light and held it like distant stars. And for a split second Ethan forgot how to breathe, because those eyes locked onto him with perfect precision. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, not like prey, not like a threat, but like a question she'd been waiting to ask. Then her lips curved, just enough to change the entire room, and her voice slipped through the air, quiet and clear and far too close to his ear for the distance between them. I can't hear you. The panel in his hand beeped, warning of a system fault, but Ethan didn't move, didn't look away, because every instinct said step back, leave, call security, do anything except stand there, and yet his feet stayed rooted to the floor as if something deeper than fear had taken hold. Yeah, he said after a second, voice steadier than he felt, figured that out. The containment field pulsed once, reacting to a fluctuation he hadn't fixed yet, and for a heartbeat the light flickered across her face, revealing something softer beneath the stillness, something that didn't match the word monster at all. And that was the moment everything started to change, though he wouldn't understand how or why until much later, when the station alarms began to fail and the distance between them was no longer measured in feet, but in choices he couldn't take back. The alarm did not sound, but Ethan felt it anyway, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a faint vibration under his boots that told him the station was not as stable as it pretended to be, and yet the only thing he could focus on was the way she was still looking at him, unblinking, as if she had already measured every breath he would take next. He forced himself to glance back at the diagnostic panel, fingers moving over the interface, pulling up the containment field data just to prove to himself he still remembered why he was there. Numbers scrolling in uneven patterns, power fluctuations spiking in intervals that made no sense unless something inside the field was interfering with it. Something alive, something aware. You are not afraid, she said quietly, her voice carrying through the hum of the field without distortion, as if the barrier recognized her authority, but not his. Ethan let out a slow breath, eyes still on the panel. That is a strong assumption, he replied, adjusting a calibration node, watching the energy line stabilize for half a second before dipping again. Your heart rate increased when you entered, she continued, almost thoughtful, but it did not tell you to leave. He paused, just for a moment, then allowed himself to glance back at her. Maybe I am just bad at listening to it. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one, and the temperature dipped again, enough that he could feel it through the fabric of his jacket. The panel chirped softly, highlighting a fault deep in the system, something tied directly to her containment lattice, and Ethan frowned, stepping closer despite himself, close enough now that the faint glow of the field cast shifting light across his hands. Your system is failing, she said, almost casually. He huffed a quiet breath. Yeah, I gathered that, he muttered, pulling a tool from his belt and opening a maintenance port, the metal warm under his fingers despite the cold air. Trying to figure out why. Silence stretched between them for a few seconds, but it was not empty. It was full of awareness, like standing near a live current you could not see. Then she spoke again, softer this time. It weakens when you approach. His hand stilled. He glanced up at her slowly. That is not how these systems are designed, he said, though even as he spoke he knew the readings were backing her up. The closer he stood, the more unstable the field became, as if it could not decide whether to hold or yield. She took a single step forward, and the lattice of light shimmered, bending inward before snapping back into place, and Ethan felt something in his chest tighten, not fear exactly, something sharper, more focused. It responds to intention, she said. Yours is unusual. He swallowed, straightening slightly, suddenly aware of how little distance there really was between them. Unusual how, he asked. Her eyes held his, steady and clear. You do not see me as something to control, she said, or something to fear. The words settled heavier than they should have, and Ethan let out a small, humorless breath. That is because I am just here to fix a broken system, he said, not judge what is inside it. For the first time, something shifted in her expression, not power, not calculation, something quieter, something almost uncertain, and the field flickered again, this time longer, the hum dropping to a lower frequency that resonated through the floor. Ethan's gaze snapped back to the panel as warnings began to cascade across the screen. That is new, he murmured, quickly rerouting power through a secondary circuit. Behind him, her voice came again, closer than before, though she had not moved. If the system fails, she said, they will not try to repair it. He hesitated. What will they do? The answer came without hesitation, calm and certain. They will remove the problem. The words lingered in the cold air, and for the first time since entering the room, Ethan felt the weight of what that meant settle into his chest, heavier than any tool he carried, heavier than any rule he was supposed to follow. And when he looked back at her again, the distance between them felt smaller than ever, as if the station itself was quietly stepping out of the way. The hum of the containment field did not just fluctuate anymore. It pulsed, slow and uneven like something learning how to breathe again, and Ethan could feel it through the soles of his boots as he rerouted power for the third time, each adjustment buying only seconds before the system slipped back into instability. The air had changed, not colder exactly, but sharper, like the moment before a storm breaks, and it made every sound feel louder than it should have been. The faint click of his tools, the quiet rhythm of his own breathing, and beneath it all, something else, something he could not quite name, but could not ignore either. You should step back, she said softly, her voice threading through the shifting energy with unsettling clarity. Ethan shook his head without looking up. If I step back, the field drops faster, he replied, eyes tracking the cascading warnings across the panel. And if that happens, I do not think your situation improves. A faint pause followed, not resistance, not agreement, just observation. You are trying to save a system that was designed to fail, she said. He let out a quiet breath. That is most systems. Out here, he answered, tightening a connector until the vibration steadied for a moment. Does not mean I stopped trying. The light flickered again, longer this time, and for a fraction of a second the barrier between them thinned enough that he could feel it, not physically, but like a shift in pressure against his skin, like standing too close to a live wire that never quite touches you. He froze, instinct catching up with him at last, and slowly lifted his gaze. She had not moved, but something about her presence felt closer, more defined, as if the failing field had stopped blurring the edges of her existence. Your heart is faster now, she noted quietly. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a small, steadying motion. Yeah, he said, almost under his breath. That one I am listening to. Her eyes held his, not predatory, not gentle, just aware in a way that made it difficult to look away. You are still here, she said. It was not a question. He gave a small shrug, though it felt heavier than it should have. Someone has to be, he replied. The panel chimed sharply, a new alert flashing across the screen, core containment reserves dropping below safe thresholds, and Ethan's focus snapped back, hands moving faster now, bypassing standard protocols, drawing power from auxiliary systems that were never meant to support something like this. If I stabilize the flow, it might hold, he muttered, more to himself than to her, fingers working through the sequence. Behind him, the hum shifted again, deeper this time, resonating through the walls, through the air, through him, and he realized with a quiet jolt that it was not just the system reacting. It was her. Why? She asked suddenly. The word cut through the noise, simple and direct. Ethan hesitated, his hands slowing just enough for the panel to warn him again. Why what? He said, though he already knew. Why do you remain? She clarified. You have no obligation to me. He stared at the interface for a second longer, then let out a slow breath, the answer forming without effort, surprising him with its simplicity. Because you are not a problem to remove, he said. You are a person stuck in a bad system. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, not with tension, but with something shifting just beneath the surface, something neither of them fully understood yet. The field flickered again, but this time it did not snap back as quickly, the lattice of light thinning at one point near his shoulder, just enough that the boundary between them blurred for a heartbeat longer than it should have. Ethan felt it then, not contact, not exactly, but presence, close enough that the air between them seemed to hold its breath. You are going to break their design, she said quietly. He glanced up, meeting her gaze again. Maybe it needs breaking, he replied. Somewhere deeper in the station, a distant system groaned under the strain of the rerouted power, and for the first time, Ethan understood that this was no longer just a repair job, it was a choice, one that was already reshaping everything around him, including the space between him and the one person the entire station had decided was not worth saving. The system warning did not escalate into a full alarm, but Ethan knew that only meant someone higher up had not noticed yet, or worse, had noticed and was choosing to wait, and that thought settled uneasily in the back of his mind as he rerouted another stream of power through circuits that were never meant to carry this kind of load. The station lights dimmed for a fraction of a second, then steadied, but the change was enough to remind him that every adjustment he made here echoed somewhere else, in corridors filled with people who had no idea what was happening behind this sealed door. The containment field flickered again, thinner now along the edge closest to him. The lattice no longer a perfect barrier, but a wavering boundary that reacted every time he shifted his weight, every time he drew a breath. They will notice, she said quietly, her voice calm, almost detached, as if she were describing something inevitable rather than something to fear. Ethan tightened his grip on the tool in his hand, not looking at her this time. Yeah, he answered. They usually do. He paused, then added under his breath, just hoping not yet. The panel pulsed with a new series of alerts, not just containment instability now, but system-wide power redistribution warnings, and Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think through the noise, to find the pattern inside the chaos. You said it responds to intention. He said after a moment, eyes scanning the data. That means it is not just failing. It is adapting. There was a subtle shift in the air, almost like a quiet acknowledgement. It is reacting to you, she replied. He let out a faint, incredulous breath. That is not better. It is not worse either, she said. It simply is. Ethan glanced up at her then, studying the way she stood within the fading light, not pressing against it, not testing it, just existing in a way that made the system seem unnecessary. If it keeps thinning like this, it is going to collapse, he said. And when it does, they will not wait for me to explain. Her gaze did not waver. You think explanation would change their decision? She asked. He hesitated, then shook his head slightly. No, he admitted. But I am still going to try. The hum dropped lower again, almost below the threshold of hearing, and Ethan felt it more than heard it. A resonance in his chest that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. And for a second, he wondered if the system was syncing to him, or if he was the one adjusting without realizing it. The boundary between them flickered once more, and this time it did not fully return to its original shape, leaving a narrow section where the light bent inward, softer, almost transparent. Ethan noticed it immediately, his instincts sharpening, every part of him aware of how close he was standing now, how little separated them. "You should move back," she said again. But there was something different in her tone now, not a warning, not exactly, something closer to uncertainty. He shook his head. "If I move, it drops faster," he repeated. "You already told me that." A faint pause followed. Then she took a small step forward, and the field responded, not resisting, not holding, but shifting, as if it recognized her movement and chose not to oppose it in that one place. Ethan's breath caught, just for a second, as the distance between them narrowed to something that felt almost fragile. "You are changing it," she said, her voice quieter now. "Or it is changing you." He gave a small, almost tired smile. "Either way," he said, "it is not what they planned." Somewhere deep in the station, another system groaned under the strain, a low metallic sound that echoed through the structure like a warning the walls themselves could not contain, and Ethan knew time was slipping, that whatever line he had crossed by staying here was already behind him. He looked at the panel one more time, then slowly reached up and adjusted a final control, not to stabilize the field completely, but to hold it in that fragile, shifting state where it no longer behaved the way it was designed to. "There," he murmured. "Not fixed, but not failing either." The air stilled, the hum settling into something new, something quieter, and for the first time since he entered the room, the space between them did not feel like a barrier at all, but like a question waiting to be answered. The silence that followed was not empty. It was precise, like the moment between two breaths when the body forgets whether to inhale or exhale, and Ethan stood there with his hand still hovering near the control panel, feeling the entire station recalibrate around a decision he had already made without fully understanding it. The containment field no longer hummed with rigid authority. It whispered, a softer frequency that seemed to fold around both of them rather than divide them. And for the first time since he entered the room, Ethan realized he could not clearly tell where the boundary ended and the open air began. He swallowed, the taste of metal lingering faintly at the back of his throat, and slowly lowered his hand. "That should hold for a while," he said, though the words felt less like certainty and more like hope given shape. She watched him in that same steady way, but something had changed, something subtle in the way her gaze moved, not measuring anymore, not calculating, but observing with a kind of quiet attention that made him more aware of himself than any warning alarm ever could. "You altered the system to match something it was not designed to contain," she said. Ethan let out a small breath. "Yeah," he replied. "Turns out rigid systems do not do well with things they do not understand." He shifted his weight slightly, testing the air, and the absence of resistance where the field had once been strongest made his chest tighten just a little. "How close am I allowed to get before this becomes a bad idea?" he asked, half to himself, half to her. A faint pause followed, then she answered, softer now. "That depends on what you consider a bad idea." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Usually the kind that gets me reassigned to a worse station," he said, though his eyes did not leave hers. He took a cautious step forward. The air did not push back. The light did not flare. The system did not react the way it was supposed to. Instead, the space between them seemed to settle, as if it had been waiting for that exact movement. His pulse picked up again, steady but undeniable, and he was suddenly aware of every inch of distance left between them, not as a barrier, but as something fragile that could disappear if he chose to close it. "You are still not afraid," she said. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That is not true," he replied. "I just decided not to let it decide for me." Her eyes held his, and for a moment there was something there he had not seen before, not power, not detachment, something closer to recognition, as if his answer had shifted something inside her the same way his adjustments had shifted the field. "Most who come here feel fear before they understand," she said. "You seem to understand before you choose fear." He shook his head slightly. "No," he said quietly. "I just see someone standing in a system that was built to keep her from being seen as anything else." The words lingered between them, heavier than they sounded, and the faint glow around her softened, almost imperceptibly, like light reflecting off water instead of glass. Another distant tremor ran through the station, a reminder that time was still moving, that whatever fragile balance he had created would not last forever. He glanced briefly at the panel, watching the numbers hold, for now, then looked back at her. They are going to check this eventually, he said. And when they do, they are not going to like what they find. She tilted her head slightly, considering him. And what will you do then? She asked. Ethan let out a quiet breath, the answer forming without hesitation this time. I will still be here, he said. The simplicity of it seemed to catch something in the air, something that neither of them named, and for a moment the station, the systems, the distant weight of everything outside that room faded into the background, leaving only the quiet space between two beings who were no longer separated by design, but connected by a choice that had just begun to take shape. The station did not stay quiet for long, because systems like this were never meant to tolerate uncertainty, and Ethan felt the first sign of it not as a sound, but as a shift in the lighting overhead, a faint flicker that traveled down the corridor outside the containment room like a signal passing through nerves. He did not look away from her when it happened, but he noticed it, the way you notice your own pulse without needing to check it, and something in his chest tightened, not with fear, but with awareness that whatever fragile space they had created was already being questioned by something larger than both of them. They are scanning, she said softly, her voice almost blending with the new rhythm of the field. Ethan nodded once, slow and deliberate. Yeah, he replied. That did not take long. He turned slightly toward the panel, eyes flicking across the incoming data stream. External diagnostics pinging the containment system, probing for inconsistencies, and he could see it clearly now, the pattern of suspicion forming in lines of code that were not supposed to think, but somehow did. They are going to see the variance, he muttered. And when they do, they are going to want a reason. Behind him, she stepped closer again, and this time the air shifted in a way that made him pause, not because it resisted, but because it did not, because there was nothing left to push against, nothing left to separate them except a thin, fading distortion in the light that no longer behaved like a barrier at all. Then give them one, she said. Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. It is not that simple, he answered. Out here, simple answers usually come with consequences. He reached up and adjusted the panel again, not to fix the system, but to shape what it would show, smoothing the fluctuations just enough to look like a temporary anomaly rather than a deliberate change. If I can make it look unstable instead of altered, they might delay intervention, he said. Might she? Repeated, the word carrying just enough weight to remind him how little certainty he actually had. He glanced back at her, and for the first time the distance between them felt almost non-existent, close enough that he could see the subtle shift of light across her skin, the way it responded to the station's dim glow rather than reflecting it, as if it held its own quiet source. You are not concerned about what happens next, he observed. Her gaze remained steady. Concern implies lack of control, she said. I am aware. He considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod. Must be nice, he said. Another flicker passed through the lights, stronger this time, followed by a low tone from the panel that did not belong to the containment system at all. Ethan's eyes sharpened, scanning the new alert, and his expression shifted, just slightly. That is not diagnostics, he said under his breath. That is a pre-authorization request. The words settled heavier than anything before them, because he knew exactly what that meant, not a check, not a repair, but a decision already forming somewhere beyond this room. They are not waiting, he added quietly. For the first time, something in her expression changed more clearly, not fear, but focus, a narrowing of attention that made the air feel sharper again. Then your time is shorter than you expected, she said. Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself, his mind already moving ahead, calculating options that did not exist a few minutes ago. Yeah, he replied. Seems like it. He looked back at the panel, then at the thin, almost invisible line where the field used to be, then back at her, and something inside him settled into place. Not panic, not hesitation, just a decision taking shape the same way the system had reshaped itself around him. If they are not going to give me time, he said quietly, then I am not going to ask for it. The station hummed around them, louder now, as if it could feel the shift in intention the same way the field had, and for a moment everything else faded again, leaving only the space between them, no longer defined by barriers or systems, but by a choice that was about to be tested. The station did not announce the decision out loud, but Ethan felt it in the way. The air changed, in the way the lights steadied into something colder and more deliberate, like a system no longer asking questions but preparing to act, and his eyes locked onto the panel as the pre-authorization signal resolved into a countdown hidden beneath layers of protocol that most technicians would never notice. 30 seconds, maybe less, before containment override. He exhaled slowly, steadying his hands, because panic would not buy him time, and time was the only thing he did not have. They are initiating control, he said quietly, not looking at her yet. Full override. Behind him, her presence sharpened, not moving, but becoming more defined in a way that made the space feel smaller. And you? She asked. Ethan's fingers moved across the interface, faster now, bypassing safety locks, rewriting small pieces of code that were never meant to be touched in real time. I am going to interrupt their assumption, he replied. The panel pulsed in response, resisting him at first, then yielding in small increments as he forced the system to recognize a different set of priorities. Not compliance, not containment, but delay. The hum of the field shifted again, unstable but not collapsing, held in that fragile state he had created, and the boundary between them thinned further, now little more than a shimmer that reacted to their proximity instead of controlling it. You are not stopping them, she said. No, he answered, eyes fixed on the data stream. Just making it harder for them to be certain. Another flicker passed through the lights, followed by a low mechanical tone from somewhere beyond the walls, distant but unmistakable, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. They are moving closer, he added. Physical confirmation. The words hung in the air, heavier than before, because this was no longer just a system problem. It was becoming a presence, people walking down a corridor with a decision already made. He finally looked at her again, and the distance between them was almost gone now, close enough that he could feel the subtle change in temperature where her presence met his, not cold, not warm, something in between that made his senses sharpen instead of dull. If they come through that door, he said, I cannot hide this anymore. Her gaze did not waver. You were never hiding, she replied. He gave a small, quiet breath that might have been a laugh if there were anything amusing about it. Fair point. The panel chimed again, the countdown slipping lower, and Ethan reached for one final control, not part of the standard system at all, something buried deep in the architecture, a manual bridge between containment and environmental regulation. This is not how this is supposed to work, he murmured, almost to himself, as he forced the connection open. The system resisted harder this time, the interface flickering, lines of code scrambling to maintain order, and for a second he thought it might reject him entirely. Then it shifted. The hum changed. The last visible trace of the barrier between them softened, not disappearing, but no longer holding its original shape, more suggestion than structure. Ethan felt it immediately, the absence of resistance, the presence of something else entirely, and his breath caught just slightly as he realized how close they truly were now, how nothing remained between them that the system could enforce. You are crossing a threshold, she said quietly. He met her gaze, steady despite everything else moving around them. Yeah, he replied. I think I already did. The distant sound grew louder now, not a threat, not a warning, just footsteps carried through metal corridors, and Ethan knew they were almost out of time. He glanced once more at the panel, confirming what he had done, then let his hand fall to his side, no longer trying to fix the system, only holding it in this fragile, altered state for as long as it would last. Whatever happens next, he said softly, it is not going to follow their plan. The station seemed to pause with him, the hum settling into a strange, quiet rhythm, and in that moment, with the barrier gone and the world outside closing in, the only thing that felt certain was the choice he had made, and the presence standing just inches away from him, no longer contained, no longer defined by anything except what she chose to do next. The first knock did not sound like a threat, it sounded polite, controlled, the kind of measured contact that meant whoever stood on the other side of the door already believed they were in charge of what happened next, and Ethan felt the weight of that certainty press against the room even before the panel confirmed the external presence. He did not turn. Immediately, his attention still anchored on the space between him and her, on the absence of the barrier that had defined everything only moments ago, and the way the air now held something quieter, something real. They are here, he said softly, though the words felt unnecessary. Yes, she replied, her voice just as calm, but closer now, not because she had moved, but because there was nothing left to keep her distant. The panel chimed again, a formal request to open the containment access, followed by a second, less patient signal layered beneath it, and Ethan finally glanced toward the door, then back to her, measuring something that had no clear unit, no system to define it. If I do not open it, he said, they will override. And if you do? She asked. He exhaled slowly. Then I decide how this begins. The second knock came, firmer this time, the sound carrying through the metal like a countdown that did not need numbers, and Ethan stepped away from the panel, not retreating, just repositioning himself in a way that felt deliberate, like placing himself between two outcomes instead of choosing one. You said they would remove the problem, he said, his voice low. Do you still believe that? She studied him, not answering immediately, her gaze tracing something in his expression that he could not see himself. I believe they do not understand what they are removing, she said at last. He nodded once. Yeah, he murmured. That makes two of them. The control panel pulsed again, the override sequence now visible, 10 seconds remaining, and Ethan knew there was no more time to adjust systems or rewrite outcomes from behind a screen. Whatever happened next would not be shaped by code. It would be shaped by presence. He reached out and canceled the automatic override, not to stop it, but to take ownership of it, then placed his hand on the manual release. The metal was warm under his palm, steady, real, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not in hesitation, but in recognition of the line he was about to cross completely. Ethan, she said quietly, and the sound of his name in her voice made something in his chest tighten in a way no system warning ever had. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Yeah, he replied. She held his gaze. Something unspoken passing between them, something that did not need explanation. Whatever you choose, she said, you will not be able to return to what you were. He let out a small breath, almost a smile. I think that part already happened, he answered. The override countdown reached 0, and instead of letting the system take control, Ethan pressed the release himself. The door opened with a slow mechanical slide, revealing the corridor beyond, figures standing in ordered formation, their presence precise, controlled, and entirely certain of their authority. The air shifted again, tension entering the room not as force, but as expectation, and Ethan stepped forward slightly, just enough to place himself clearly in view, his body between them and the space behind him. Containment status? One of them asked, voice neutral, professional, as if this were just another routine check. Ethan did not look back. He did not need to. Stable, he replied. The word hung there, simple and unqualified, and for a moment nothing moved, nothing changed, as if the entire station was waiting to see whether that statement would hold. Behind him, he could feel her presence, not hidden, not restrained, just there, and for the first time, the system that had been built to define her no longer had the final say. And neither did the one standing in the doorway. The silence after his answer stretched longer than it should have, not because anyone hesitated, but because something in the room had shifted beyond protocol, beyond expectation, and the figures standing in the doorway seemed to register it without fully understanding why. The one at the front stepped forward half a pace, just enough to enter the threshold without committing to the space, their presence controlled, measured, as if they expected the room itself to confirm their authority. Define stable. The voice said, calm but edged with precision, the kind of tone that did not ask for clarification so much as test for inconsistency. Ethan kept his shoulders relaxed, his stance unchanged, aware of every inch of space behind him without turning to look. Field integrity is holding, he replied. No active breach, no escalation. It was not a lie, not exactly, but it was not the full truth either, and he felt that distinction settle into the air like something fragile that could fracture if pressed too hard. The panel beside him pulsed. Softly, reflecting the same delicate balance. Numbers steady but not compliant, stable but not controlled. We are reading variance. Another voice added from behind the first, quieter but sharper, like a second set of eyes looking at the same problem from a different angle. Ethan nodded slightly, as if that were expected. Power redistribution ripple, he said. System compensated, but it is not perfectly clean. He let the explanation sit there, technical enough to be plausible, incomplete enough to avoid deeper questions, and for a moment it seemed to hold. The figures exchanged brief glances, subtle, practiced, their communication efficient and silent, and Ethan could almost feel the calculation happening, weighing his words against their data, their assumptions against the reality standing just a few feet behind him. "We will need to verify internally," the first voice said. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, though his expression did not change. "You can," he answered, "but you are not going to find what you expect." The words slipped out before he could soften them, not defiant, not confrontational, just honest in a way that did not fit the situation, and he felt the weight of that honesty settle into the room immediately. A pause followed, longer this time, not uncertainty, but adjustment, as if they were recalibrating their approach to something that did not respond the way it should. "Step aside," the voice said, still calm, but now carrying a subtle shift, a quiet insistence that assumed compliance rather than requesting it. Ethan did not move. He did not tense, did not brace. He simply remained where he was, grounded in a decision that had already been made before the door ever opened. "No," he said. The word was quiet, almost understated, but it changed everything. The air tightened, not with force, but with expectation breaking against something it could not pass through, and for a moment no one spoke, as if the system itself needed time to process a response it had not been designed to receive. Behind him, he felt her presence shift, not stepping forward, not retreating, just aligning in a way that made the space between them feel deliberate, shared, no longer divided by design or circumstance. "You are interfering with containment protocol," the second voice said, more direct now, the edges of authority becoming more defined. Ethan let out a slow breath, steady, controlled. "No," he repeated, softer this time. "I am redefining it." The words lingered, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore, and for the first time since they arrived, something in the stance of the figures at the doorway changed, not retreating, not advancing, but pausing in a way that suggested the situation was no longer as simple as they had assumed. The panel beside Ethan flickered once, the system holding its fragile equilibrium, and in that moment, standing between two worlds that no longer aligned, he realized the line he had crossed was not just technical, not just procedural, it was something deeper, something that could not be undone by stepping back. And behind him, just within reach, stood the one reason he did not even consider trying. The word hung in the air longer than anything else that had been said, not because it was loud, but because it did not belong, and Ethan could feel that difference ripple through the room the same way the containment field had reacted to him earlier, subtle, but impossible to ignore. The figures at the doorway did not move immediately, but their stillness was no longer neutral, it was deliberate, recalculating, as if they were no longer certain which part of the situation required control first. The one in front shifted their stance slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to signal a change in approach. "You are exceeding your operational authority," the voice said, calm and measured, but no longer entirely detached. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the steady rhythm of his own breathing anchor him in place, even as everything else around him seemed to tighten. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "I noticed." His gaze did not waver, and for a moment the distance between him and the doorway felt larger than it was, as if something unseen had expanded the space, not physically, but in a way that made crossing it less certain. Behind him, he could feel her presence shift again, not moving closer, but aligning with him, like 2 points forming a line that the room itself had to acknowledge. "Step aside," the second voice repeated, this time with less patience and more clarity, as if the situation had reached the point where options were no longer being offered. Ethan did not respond immediately. He let the silence settle, let it stretch just enough that it became part of the answer. Then shook his head once, small but final. "No," he said again, softer now, but somehow heavier. The panel beside him flickered, the system still holding that fragile balance, and he could see the data shifting in response to the tension in the room, as if the station itself was trying to interpret what was happening and failing to categorize it. "You are placing yourself between us and a classified entity," the first voice said, the words precise, structured, built to define the situation in terms that justified what would come next. Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a sigh. No, he answered. I am standing next to someone you decided not to understand. The distinction was small, but it changed the shape of the conversation entirely, and he saw it register, not as agreement, but as disruption, a break in the pattern they were used to following. A low tone sounded from somewhere deeper in the corridor, not an alarm, but a confirmation signal, and Ethan's eyes flicked briefly to the panel, catching the update before anyone else spoke. Authorization escalated. He felt it settle into his chest, heavy and unavoidable, the next step in a process that had already been set in motion long before he walked into this room. Ethan, the voice at the front said, using his name now, not as familiarity, but as a final attempt to anchor him back into a role he no longer occupied. Move aside. He closed his eyes for a brief second, not in hesitation, but in recognition of what that request actually meant, then opened them again, steady, grounded. I cannot, he said. Behind him, she moved. It was not a step, not a shift in position that could be measured in distance, but a change in presence, closer in a way that made the air feel different, as if the space between them had collapsed entirely. He felt it along his arm, a faint change in temperature, a subtle awareness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with proximity. You are choosing this, she said quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear it. Ethan did not turn, but his answer came without delay. Yeah, he said. I am. The corridor beyond the door seemed to narrow, not physically, but in the way attention focused, every detail sharpening, every movement becoming more deliberate. And for a moment, everything balanced on a point so fine it felt like it could disappear if anyone pushed too hard. Then the figure at the front took a single step forward, crossing the threshold fully for the first time, and the room seemed to shift in response. The system, the air, the space between all of them adjusting to a new reality that no longer followed the rules it was built on. And Ethan did not move. The moment the figure crossed the threshold, something unseen gave way, not in the room, not in the system, but in the assumption that control still belonged to those who claimed it, and Ethan felt it like a quiet shift in gravity, subtle but absolute. The air tightened, not with force, but with expectation meeting resistance. And for the first time since the door opened, the balance in the room no longer leaned entirely in one direction. The figure took another measured step forward, boots striking the metal floor with controlled precision, and stopped just short of Ethan, close enough now that the difference between authority and presence could be felt rather than stated. This is your final directive, the voice said, no longer asking, no longer testing, simply stating what it believed to be inevitable. Step aside. Ethan did not move. He did not brace, did not prepare, he simply stood where he was, grounded in something that no longer required justification. No, he said, quiet as before, but this time the word carried something else with it, not defiance, not resistance, but certainty. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, stretching outward, pressing against the walls, the systems, the people in the corridor, and for a moment it felt as if the entire station had paused, waiting to see what would break first. Behind him, her presence shifted again, not forward, not back, but closer in a way that had nothing to do with distance, and Ethan felt it along his side, a faint change in the air, a presence that did not demand space, but occupied it completely. You do not need to stand between us, the second voice said, sharper now, less composed, as if the situation had slipped beyond the boundaries it was meant to follow. Ethan let out a slow breath, steady, controlled. I am not standing between you, he replied. I am standing with her. The distinction settled into the room like a fracture line, invisible but undeniable, and for the first time, something in the stance of the figures shifted, not retreating, but adjusting in a way that suggested they were no longer certain which part of the situation they controlled. The panel beside Ethan flickered again, the system still holding that fragile state, no longer enforcing separation, no longer reinforcing authority, simply existing in a balance that reflected the choices being made within it. You are compromising station security, the first voice said, but the words lacked the same certainty as before, as if they were being repeated from a script that no longer fully applied. Ethan gave a small, almost tired shake of his head. No, he said. I am correcting it. The response was simple, but it carried weight. and he saw it register, not as agreement, but as something that could not be easily dismissed. A low tone sounded again from the corridor, deeper this time, and Ethan knew what it meant without needing to check the panel. Escalation had reached its limit. There would be no further requests. The figure in front of him shifted slightly, not stepping forward again, but preparing, and Ethan felt the moment tighten, the space narrowing to a single point where everything converged. Behind him, her voice came again, softer than before, but clearer than anything else in the room. "You are still choosing this," she said. Ethan did not turn, but his answer came without hesitation. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I am not going anywhere." For a brief second, nothing happened, no movement, no sound. Just a stillness so complete it felt unreal, like the pause before something irreversible. And then, instead of pressure, instead of force, something unexpected shifted. The presence behind him changed, not expanding, not overtaking, but focusing, like light being drawn into a single point, and Ethan felt it, not as a threat, but as awareness, precise and controlled. The air cooled slightly, the hum of the system dropped into a quieter register, and the space around them seemed to realign, not around authority, not around protocol, but around something else entirely. The figure in front of him hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and in that hesitation, Ethan realized something that none of them had accounted for. This was no longer a situation defined by containment. It was something else now, something neither side fully understood. And for the first time since the door opened, the outcome was no longer certain. The hesitation did not last long, but it existed, and that alone changed everything. Because hesitation meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was something the system, the station, and the people standing in that doorway had never been designed to accommodate. Ethan felt it like a shift in pressure, subtle but undeniable, and he held his ground not by force, but by refusing to move, refusing to let the moment collapse back into something simple. The figure in front of him adjusted slightly, recalibrating stance and focus, but the certainty that had defined their presence before was no longer absolute. It had fractured just enough to let something else in. "Stand down," the voice said, but this time it carried a different weight, not command, not request, something closer to a test, as if they were waiting to see if he would break the tension for them. Ethan did not. He exhaled slowly, steady, his pulse firm but controlled, and for the first time he realized he was not waiting for them to act. He was waiting for her. Behind him, the air shifted again, but not outward, not in a way that pushed against the room. Instead it focused inward, precise, controlled, like a quiet gravity forming around a single point. He felt it along his back, along his shoulder, a presence that did not demand space, but redefined it entirely. "They expect a reaction," she said softly, her voice low enough that only he could hear it. Ethan nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Yeah," he murmured. "They always do." The panel beside him flickered again, but this time the data did not spike, it settled, the system holding in that fragile, altered state he had created, no longer enforcing separation, no longer signaling threat, just existing in a balance that mirrored the moment itself. "Then do not give them the one they want," she said. Ethan's breath slowed, matching the quiet rhythm in the air, and something in his chest eased, not because the situation had improved, but because it had become clear. This was not about stopping them. It was about changing what they believed they were seeing. He shifted his stance slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just enough to no longer appear as a barrier, but as something else entirely, something that did not oppose, but did not yield either. "Containment remains stable," he said again, his voice calm, even, but now carrying something deeper, something that did not come from protocol, but from conviction. The words settled differently this time, not as a report, but as a statement of reality. And for a moment the figures at the doorway did not respond, because the system behind him was no longer contradicting him, the data no longer aligning with the assumptions they had brought into the room. "We are not detecting hostile fluctuation," one of them said after a second, quieter now, the edge of certainty dulled by what they were seeing. Ethan did not turn, but he felt it, the way the room had shifted, the way the narrative they had arrived with was slipping out of alignment with the reality in front of them. Behind him, her presence remained steady, not expanding, not pressing, just existing in a way that did not trigger the system, did not provoke the reaction they expected. Because there is none, Ethan said quietly. The statement hung in the air, simple, direct, and for the first time since the door opened, it did not feel like something that needed to be defended. The figure at the front studied him, then the space behind him, then the panel, and something in their posture changed again, not retreating, but no longer advancing either, as if the path forward was no longer clear. The low tone from the corridor faded, replaced by a quieter signal, one that did not demand immediate action, and Ethan felt it like a release of pressure he had not realized he was holding. "We will reassess," the voice said finally, and though the words were measured, controlled, they carried something new, something that had not been there before. Uncertainty. Ethan did not respond. He did not need to. The figures began to withdraw, one step at a time, not turning their backs, not breaking formation, but no longer pressing forward, and as the distance grew, the room seemed to breathe again, the tension easing into something quieter, something fragile but real. The door slid closed with a soft mechanical sound, sealing the space once more, and for a moment Ethan stood there, still, listening to the fading echo of their presence, feeling the absence of pressure settle into the air. Then he exhaled, long and slow, and finally turned. She was standing just behind him, closer than ever, no barrier, no distortion, just presence, clear and undeniable. "You changed their perception," she said softly. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. "No," he replied. "I just showed them something they were not ready to see." The hum of the station settled into a quieter rhythm, and in that silence, something else remained, something that had not been there before, not part of the system, not part of the protocol, but something entirely human and entirely new. The quiet that followed did not feel like an ending. It felt like something being allowed to exist for the first time, fragile but undeniable, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the station breathe around him in a way it had not before, softer, less certain, as if even the systems were still adjusting to what had just happened. The panel beside him no longer pulsed with urgency, its data steady but no longer rigid, the containment protocols still present but no longer absolute, like rules that had been rewritten without anyone formally approving the change. He let out a slow breath, feeling the tension leave his shoulders in stages, not all at once. And when he turned fully toward her, there was nothing between them anymore. No distortion, no barrier, just space and presence, and the quiet weight of everything that had shifted. She watched him the same way she always had, steady, aware, but there was something different now, something less distant, as if the line that had once defined her role in this place had finally dissolved. "They will return," she said softly. Ethan nodded once, not surprised. "Yeah," he replied. "They will need to understand what they just saw." He took a small step back, not to create distance, but to take her in fully, to see her not as part of a system, not as a problem to solve, but as someone standing in front of him without anything artificial shaping the space between them. "And you?" she asked. "What will you do when they come back with clearer answers?" He exhaled, the question settling into him without resistance, because the answer had already been there, forming quietly beneath everything else. "I will still be here," he said, just like before. She studied him for a moment, and this time the silence between them felt different, not filled with tension, but with recognition, as if something fundamental had been acknowledged without needing to be spoken out loud. The station lights above flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft glow that no longer felt harsh or clinical, just present, just enough to outline the reality of the moment. "You altered more than their perception," she said after a while. Ethan gave a faint, almost thoughtful smile. "Maybe," he answered. "Or maybe I just stopped pretending the system was right." The hum of the station settled into a quiet rhythm, lower now, almost calm, and for a moment neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching not as a gap, but as something complete in itself. Then she stepped forward. It was a simple movement, unforced, but it carried a weight that nothing else in the room had, because it was not resisted, not corrected, not contained. She closed the last of the distance between them, stopping just short of contact, her presence clear and real in a way that made the rest of the station feel distant. Ethan felt his breath catch slightly, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from the realization of how close they truly were now, how nothing remained between them except choice. "You did not see me as something to control," she said quietly. He shook his head once. "No," he replied. "I saw you as someone who deserved better than this." The words settled into the space between them, simple, unguarded, and for a moment the entire universe seemed to narrow down to that single exchange. She held his gaze, and something in her expression softened, not losing strength, but reshaping it into something quieter, something deeper. "Then you have already changed more than you realize," she said. Ethan let out a slow breath, the weight of everything finally settling into something he could carry. "Maybe," he said, "but I think you did too." The lights dimmed slightly as the station shifted into a lower power state, the hum fading into a near silence that wrapped around them like a pause the universe itself had chosen to take. And in that quiet, with no systems left to define them, no barriers left to separate them, there was only one truth that remained, simple and undeniable. He had not been trying to conquer anything. He had not been trying to win. He had simply chosen to stay. And somehow, that had been enough.